This video is an introduction to the context, the life, very briefly, and the ideas of Edmund Burke, key thinker number 2 for conservatism, paper 3, political ideas. Now, there is sort of an interesting aspect to conservatism, because in the liberalism aspect of the paper, you've got John Locke, who is the father of liberalism, as key thinker 1. You've got Marx and Engels, who are considered sort of the first key thinkers to bring socialist concepts in one place in the Communist Manifesto. But Edmund Burke is our second key thinker for conservatism, who is referred to as the father of conservatism. Some will challenge the idea that Hobbes is a conservative because of his adoption of some Enlightenment thinking, whereas for Burke, he is very much considered the first individual to put the ideas of conservatism certainly into one coherent space. Now, there's an irony to this, because Edmund Burke was an Irish-born Whig Party MP, and the Conservative Party of today have evolved from the Tory faction. But Burke came from the Whig Party, and from many of his contemporaries was seen as a progressive. And actually, the key text, produced in 1790, Reflections on the Revolution in France, the ideas that Burke espoused in this text surprised many of his contemporaries, because many considered him to be a progressive thinker. But his reaction to the revolution in France, his reaction to the establishment of Enlightenment thinking in practice, his opposition to that, is what sets him out as the father of conservatism. So very briefly, let's talk about what's happening in France at this time. We see a sort of a rebellion against the structure of French society, the so-called Three Estates, the removal of the monarchy, and it was done in the name of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Liberté, equality, fraternité. And for Burke, these concepts were nebulous. And what he decides in the wake of the French Revolution and the chaos that surrounds France after the Revolution is that trying to create a state based on conceptual ideas rather than things that are based in evidence is what is going to lead to the downfall of a state. So France after the Revolution is quite a chaotic place to be and to live. And we see in the 1790s the so-called Reign of Terror, where we have public executions taking place. And there's a very real fear that these concepts, these ideas, which have some sympathy amongst liberal thinkers in Britain, there's a lot of fear, particularly geographically with how close France is, that those ideas will make their way to Britain and chaos will reign in Britain. Remember that key thinker number 2, Mary Wollstonecraft, moves to France in the wake of the revolution because she wants to live in a state based on the notion of liberty for all. Burke is taking a different view. Edmund Burke is fearful of the consequences of these ideas should they be implemented in Britain. So if you've seen the video on Hobbes already, you'll know that this part of the video is where I briefly go through the 4 key concepts: human nature, state, society, and economy. We'll start with human nature. There's some continuity with Thomas Hobbes and some change. And the continuity is that, like Hobbes, Burke is sceptical of the nature of human beings and how they behave in the absence of law, order and stability, because he's seen what has happened in France in the wake of the revolution and the removal of those institutions which maintained law and order. Now, for Burke, the one area where he begins to move away from Hobbes is he doesn't share the same level of pessimism that Hobbes does. So for Burke, there is some good in human nature. There are some examples of altruism and goodness in human beings. Burke identifies the idea of little platoons, and we'll move on to that when we look in more detail at society. But the whole concept of little platoons, again, challenges Hobbes's idea that life would be solitary in a state of nature. For Burke, we are more communal than Hobbes gives us credit for. And that kindness that Burke identifies, he believes that when human beings are rooted in that law, order and stability that Hobbes was concerned with, but also when people are in touch with the principles of the Christian faith, that is when human beings show a capability for goodness, for acting well. And liberalism is a rejection of many traditional ideas. And actually, many liberals, certainly in the early period, were quietly or privately agnostic or atheistic, because they rejected the concepts of things like original sin, that human beings in their very nature are imperfect because of the behaviour of the first humans as outlined in the Bible. Whereas liberalism rejects that, conservatism buys into the concept of original sin, and that's where Burke's idea of imperfect human beings comes from. However, when humans are brought into and practice the Christian faith, that is when they become capable of good, proper behaviour. Now, later conservatives will talk about Judeo-Christian moral values, so that you don't necessarily have to be religious, but respect that moral code that Christianity sets out. But for Burke, his conservatism is very much in keeping with his Christian faith. Okay, we'll move on to the state next, because in conservatism, the state predates society. Burke rejects Hobbes' social contract theory. For Burke, both society and the state are organic. They grow naturally and adapt naturally to serve the needs of humanity when appropriate. And for Burke, if there is a contract, as Hobbes had used that metaphor, Burke argues it's between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. And so the state and the institutions of the state should be rooted in tradition and what has worked before. So when you look back evidentially at what has provided stability and law and order, those institutions, those laws should remain. If they've worked in the past, they should continue to work in the present and in the future. However, Burke does identify that there are occasions where the state needs to adapt, but it will do so slowly, naturally, and organically. And it's Burke that gives us this concept of paternalism, the idea that the state is there to rule in the interests of those without power. So Burke accepts the idea that we are not all born equal, that in any society, be it a formal state or a little platoon, there will always be a natural hierarchy between those with the experience and the ability to rule and those without. There will always be a natural hierarchy, a natural order, and that should be maintained, because the people who have power are naturally the most gifted and experienced to do so. However, for Burke, it would be unwise for that hierarchy to become abusive, because it is in the interests of those with power to take care of those without it, to maintain that stability that conservatives are obsessed with maintaining. So, according to the state, a natural hierarchy is normal and natural and should be respected, but those with power should rule in the interests of those without. And for Burke, bonds of trust and loyalty can emerge naturally over a long period of time when it is seen that those with power are taking care of the interests of those without. And what's ironic for an MP at Westminster is that Burke actually believed, not in, like Hobbes does, a grand central structure that is all powerful. Burke actually believes in localised power to serve those so-called little platoons, which we're going to talk about now as we cover Burke and society. So, As I've said or hinted at before, Burke rejects the idea of a social contract outlined by Hobbes and instead argues in favour of an organic society, that it emerges and evolves naturally. And society on the whole is made up of a collection of so-called little platoons. Communities, they may be localised communities, but universities and schools and religious groups, churches can offer a little platoon structure. These communities are where, over a long period of time, trust and affection and is built within that little platoon. And when you have a multitude of those working in sync, that contributes to a wider society. And that natural hierarchy within those little platoons is, again, normal, natural, and should be respected. And finally, Burke on the economy. And when you listen to what Burke is arguing for, it sounds a lot like classical liberalism. And in fact, Burke and Adam Smith, who is seen as a classical liberal economist, were themselves close friends and shared many ideas that they both were fully invested in. Now, classical liberals are committed to a free market economy, and although there's less of a commitment to that from Burke, one thing that Burke is very much in favour of is a respect for private property. And that is because of this idea that Burke comes up with, that if there is a contract, it's between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. And so property is something that we human beings can do to sort of pass on to the next generation. And again, that links to conservative ideas of tradition and a respect for the way things have been in the past, continuing in the present and the future. So for Burke, it is not the state's job to interfere. He actually says in one of his works, it is not the government's job to, quote, provide for us in our necessities. The free market should operate completely separately from the interference of government. Now, things like poverty can be solved, according to Burke, through private charity, not state involvement. And we're going to see some similarities with our new right thinkers as we look at key thinkers number 4 and number 5, Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick. However, other so-called traditional conservatives will advocate protectionism to protect a nation's economy, but also will begin to see the benefits of a mixed economy and welfarism, limited government interference and involvement for the good of those who are ruled. That will get developed by One Nation conservatives like Michael Oakeshott, who you're going to hear from in another video. Again, I hope this was helpful, but please don't think that this is everything you need to know about Burke. Treat it as a starting point for revision or for going over what you already know. Use your notes inside and outside of class to put more detail into what you've already found out from this video.